Honorable Attorney General and Minister for Economy, Civil Service, Communications, Housing and Community Development, can the Minister update Parliament on the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war on the Fijian economy? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Attorney General and Minister for Economy, Civil Service, Communications, Housing and Community Development, the Honourable Aiyaz Sayed-Khaiyum. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, there's no doubt that and we're all aware of the unprovoked war that Russia actually has commenced against Ukraine, where there's untold damage and, of course, loss of life. It would appear now on both sides, including Russian troops and Ukrainian civilians and military also. In response to Russia's actions, NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its members in the wider global community has in fact imposed harsh sanctions, economic and financial sanctions on Russia, including freezing Russian central bank assets, targeting wealthy Russian oligarchs and some state-owned banks, and partially restricting its access to the international payment system, which is called SWIFT, and in other words, having an impact on the banking system. Mr. Speaker, sir, this will cause a deep recession in Russia in the event of a prolonged conflict. The sharp depreciation of the ruble has fueled inflation and lowered living standards in Russia. Countries with direct economic ties with Russia will also be affected by the sanctions, with weakened trade, remittances, investment and tourism adversely affecting economic growth, inflation, and of course external fiscal accounts. Beyond, of course, the human and economic suffering in Ukraine, sir, the entire global economy is feeling the effects of the conflict through three main channels. First, higher prices for food and energy are pushing up inflation further, even after the pandemic, eroding purchasing power and putting downward pressure on demand. Second, Ukraine's direct trading partners and neighboring countries are experiencing disruptions to trade, supply chains and remittances, not to mention a historic surge in refugee inflows. Lastly, weaker business confidence and high investment uncertainty will lead to a tighter global financial conditioning and possible capital flight from emerging markets. Both Russia and Ukraine are large producers and exporters of key food commodities, minerals and energy. Today, they account for about 30% of global wheat exports, 20% of corn, mineral fertilizers and natural gas exports, and 11% of oil exports. Mr. Speaker, so naturally this war has created sizable global economic and financial shocks, particularly in commodity markets, with the prices of oil, gas and wheat recently soaring. For fuel especially, the conflict has exacerbated the mismatch between global demand and supply, pushing crude oil prices above US $100 a barrel in March, levels not seen actually since 2008. Economies reliant on oil imports like ours will see wider fiscal and trade deficits and inflationary pressures because of the conflict. Though some exporters, such as those in the Middle East and in Africa and places like Nigeria, may temporarily benefit from higher prices. This elevated inflation, Mr. Speaker, sir, along with the lack of fiscal space, has prompted many countries to tighten their fiscal and monetary policies, posing further challenges to the economic recovery. If these shocks are sustained over the short term, the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, expects global GDP growth to reduce by 1 percentage point and inflation to rise by a further 2.5 percentage points. Mr. Speaker, sir, the Ukraine-Russia war has delivered a severe and unfortunate blow to the global economy that will hinder growth and raise prices just as we are starting to bounce back from the pandemic-induced recession. Mr. Speaker, sir, global trade disruptions and inflationary pressure are likely to intensify as the conflict drags on. Fiji is already beginning to experience the spillover effects of these trade shocks, with imported inflation pushing up domestic fuel and food prices in recent months. Fiji is particularly susceptible to fuel price shocks, given that fuel accounts for roughly 1/3 of our total import bill. Domestic fuel prices depend on three factors: the world market price for refined oil, benchmarked by the means of Platts Singapore, international freight rates, and foreign exchange rates. Moreover, sir, refinery margins, distribution costs, insurance, freight and transport costs, and geopolitical pressures also influence the direction of international fuel prices in any given month. The Fijian Competition and Consumer Commission, or FCCC, recently noted that the international price of crude oil is expected to increase significantly in the coming months also, signaling higher domestic prices for refined fuel products in the near term. Mr. Speaker, so notably local retail prices for diesel plus 2.1%, unleaded plus 1.1%, premix plus 10.7%, kerosene plus 1.1%, 4.5 kilogram gas cylinder plus 2.2%, and 12 kilogram gas cylinder plus 4.5%. All have increased in April relative to January this year. So the 9% was critically important, Mr. Speaker, sir, to actually provide some form of relief to ordinary Fijians. Likewise, sir, domestic food prices have risen in line with global supply disruptions. Most notably, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, cereal price index rose in February by 3% over the previous month, and 14.8% from a year ago, reflecting disruptions in the Black Sea region that could potentially hinder exports from Ukraine and Russia. The overall FAO food price index averaged 140.7 points in February, representing a new all-high and a 20.7% increase from a year ago. Mr. Speaker, so Fiji's domestic inflation has started to accelerate after remaining in negative territory for nearly 2 years, growing by an average of nearly 2% per month since August 2021. Annual inflation stood at 1.9% in February, with price increases noted for food and non-alcoholic beverages, health and miscellaneous services, offset by lower prices for restaurants and hotels and transportation. Over the next few months, Mr. Speaker, sir, domestic prices are expected to rise further because of fruit and vegetable shortages due to TC Cody-related flooding and global food and fuel supply disruptions due to the Russia-Ukraine war. As a result, year-end inflation is now estimated 4.5% for 2022, followed by 3.3% for 2023 and 2.6% for 2024. To put that into perspective, sir, I had the figures here somewhere about the inflation rates in other countries also. In USA, sir, the inflation rate by the Bureau of Labor Statistics as of February this year stood at 7.9%. India, 6.07%. New Zealand, 5.9% as of December last year. UK, February 22, 5.5%. Singapore, February 2022, 4.3%. Australia, December 21, 3.5%. EU area, as of February 2022, 5.9%. Russia, 9.2%. Germany, February 2022, 5.1%. And Mr. Speaker, sir, countries like, of course, Mauritius is 9%, etc. Mr. Speaker, sir, the Fiji's GDP, of course, Mr. Speaker, sir, is poised for unprecedented rebound. Of course, a lot of this can be tampered with in respect of what will happen with the pricing. That's why, Mr. Speaker, sir, of course, we put in place the revised budget on the 21 items, which is, of course, unprecedented. Fortunately, Mr. Speaker, sir, our foreign reserves are actually quite high because of government, strategically having drawdowns, external drawdowns, which help to cushion the impact of higher commodity prices on our balance of payments position. As of 31 March 2022, foreign reserves are around $3.1 billion, sufficient to cover at least 8.6 months of retained imports, sir. We'll, of course, Mr. Speaker, sir, will keep a close eye on the fluctuations of the inflation rate and commodity price over the next few months, and if necessary, we may consider additional temporary fiscal measures to shield Fijians from volatile global price markets. Thank you, sir.
I thank the Honourable Attorney General. Honourable William-Ngavoka, you have the floor.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Honourable Speaker, in the matters of oil, I know this will be where we are most vulnerable. We know that over the last couple of days, President Biden had approved the release of a couple of billion barrels of oil into the U.S. market from the reserve, and that has helped in reducing some of the world prices, global price per barrel. For us, Honourable Speaker, our reserve, how much do we have in terms of oil? And is there any possibility going forward that Fiji can carry enough reserve in terms of emergencies such as these, Honourable Speaker, or perhaps on a regional basis with our neighbours, Honourable Speaker? Thank you.
Thank you. Honourable Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, the fuel that's imported into Fiji is imported by the three fuel companies, Pacific Energy, Total, and Mobil. And thank you. And they come from Singapore. So there is obviously a shipment done on a regular basis, and there is enough fuel there. But of course, in terms of storage for months on end, there is not we don't have that capacity. But Mr. Speaker, sir, of course you need to build large-scale investments. The issue at the moment in the world is not shortage per se, but of course it's the pricing because of some certain supply chains have not been actually, or have been affected. USA, of course, has got large reserves. There has been talk about it in the sort of in the area of global economics, economy, that if the USA actually releases a bit more oil into the market, into the global market, you could in fact effectively see the prices plummet. So it's not really, a big issue regarding supply per se, because there is enough reserves all over the world. It's just that people aren't releasing it on time or trying to get a bigger price. OPEC, of course, has its own dynamics, and what the predictions are, whilst the prices will go up in the next few months, they expect that the prices could actually plummet by around about September, October. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Honorable Bicheri Bulnawada, you have the floor.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker, sir. This war will be long-term. It's going to go on. So Russia will want to collect all those people there and fight against Israel down there. So it's a long-term. Honorable Speaker, sir, what is the government doing about getting alternative fuel, wheat, food that we can eat in the future? Particularly in fuel on solar, can we increase it? On hydro, can we increase it? On biomass, can we double that or increase it? Also the wheat, Honorable Speaker, sir. A lot of places in Fiji were growing wheat at one point in time. What is agriculture doing about it? What can we grow more wheat? We increase more food. But we reduce 900,000 for the agriculture, Honorable Speaker, sir. It's a long-term, Honorable Speaker, sir. What the government in place for long-term, particularly to substitute or reduce the use of fuel and wheat for food, Honorable Speaker, sir. Honorable Speaker, sir. Thank you.
Honorable Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, I hope the honourable member in his soothsaying is incorrect. I hope that the war is not going to last for too long, but there is a possibility it could last for a long period of time. But I think there would also be some adjustments made. At the moment, the world is in a bit of a shock with what has happened. I think a lot of the world is, in fact, reeling from the fact in this modern day and age that how can a country go and invade another country or try to invade, which is unprovoked. The issue, however, Mr. Speaker, sir, in terms of alternative sources for energy, I don't think the honourable member has been in this parliament. The Prime Minister has been saying internationally, we've internationally made commitments about reducing our fossil fuel usage, in particular in providing energy for electricity purposes. We have a target, Mr. Speaker, sir, to have renewables in place. He's saying more. Yes, we are doing more. It's easier for him to just sit there and pontificate, but he has absolutely no clue how to do more. The hydroelectricity dam, of course, that was built in the 1970s, depending on the rainfall, can supply up to 60 to 65% of our energy needs on Viti Levu. Vanua Levu, of course, where he comes from, does not have that source of energy or that type of energy. But Mr. Speaker, sir, we are, as we heard in Parliament, for example, in Overlau, we've got the agro-photovoltaic project that's going ahead that will supply to the grid. In Tavuni also, we've got the agro-photovoltaic project. There's tens of millions of dollars will be invested. So those islands will actually be able to get renewable energy. And we obviously are doing more. We have an IPP system in place where a lot of private companies are now interested in supplying to the grid. In respect of eating wheat, of course, the Honourable Minister for Agriculture has already stated that they're currently experimenting about having 20 to 25% of cassava flour or cassava meal in normal flour, so we'll actually reduce our usage to 100% usage of wheat, sir. The other alternative, of course, Mr. Honourable Bula Nauda, whilst you're packing your bag to leave, is that, Mr. Speaker, sir, is that he should stop eating wheat products. The alternative, of course, to wheat is everybody wants to eat purini, bambakau, pani keke, bread, Mr. Speaker, sir. We eat roti that's made out of flour. So there are alternatives to it. I mean, as I mentioned also, Ukraine also produces a lot of corn. The alternative to wheat is corn or maize. Central American countries grow it, South American countries grow it. So there are alternatives. And I think as we've seen with the human capacity to be able to adapt, a lot of people do change. So if you have more dalo, cassava, bele, bhaji, bhindi, bora, all of these things, these are alternatives. And that's what we can do individually, change in our own lives, rather than saying, what is government going to do about it? Government, these things are only imported because there's a consumption demand for it. Private companies actually import it. The wheat that we actually bring in from Fiji is brought by 2 private companies. So I think there needs to be a bit more appreciation of what are the dynamics at play, and I'm sure the world will actually make the adjustments accordingly. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We will move on.